Christmas morning came to Bel-Air Plantation with all the formality expected of one of Louisiana's most respected estates. It was the year 1847, and Henry Dufresne had many reasons to feel proud. At 32 years old, he had inherited his father's sugar empire 6 months earlier, changing overnight from the overlooked younger son into the owner of 3,000 acres of land and 170 enslaved people. The great house shone with crystal chandeliers imported from Paris at great cost, and the smell of roasted duck blended with fresh pine garlands throughout the grand parlor. Outside, the December air felt unusually cold for Louisiana. Frost edged the stone fountain in the courtyard, forming thin patterns of ice that sparkled in the early light. The household had prepared for this day for weeks. The kitchen staff worked through the night, creating rich dishes meant to fill the long mahogany table in the dining room. The house servants polished every surface until it reflected light, placed wreaths on every door, and set candles glowing in each window. The scene was meant to show wealth, order, and elegance, the kind that would impress even the harshest critics from New Orleans society. Yet the gift waiting in the courtyard would tear apart everything Henry believed about his family, his past, and himself. Henry walked down the front steps with the steady confidence of a man finally standing in his rightful place. His older brother, Philip, had been raised from birth to manage Bel-Air, while Henry had been sent to New Orleans to study law and build his own future. But yellow fever had taken Philip 3 years earlier, and their father had died just 6 months ago. With them gone, Henry became the sole heir to everything the Dufresne name had built over 3 generations. The change had not been easy. Overseers quietly tested his authority. Neighboring planters watched closely, waiting for mistakes. Henry himself felt the heavy weight of responsibility. His 20s had been spent in the freedom of city life, arguing cases in court, attending the theater, and enjoying the cultured pleasures of New Orleans. Now he was tied to the land, to the people on it, and to a way of life he had never fully accepted. Charles Beaumont stood near the fountain, wearing the pleased smile of a man confident in his choice. Charles was Henry's closest friend from his New Orleans years, a successful cotton broker who had helped him manage the complicated business deals that kept Bel-Air profitable. He was a few years older, his hair beginning to gray, carrying the relaxed assurance of someone born into comfort and status. "Merry Christmas, my friend," Charles said as Henry approached. "I know you've been searching for someone capable of running the household. Your mother's longtime housekeeper passed away last spring, and I heard finding a replacement has been difficult. This woman comes very highly recommended. She can read and write, has good manners, and is trained in fine service. Her previous owner was settling debts in Natchez. The moment I saw her papers, I thought of you." Henry's attention moved to the woman standing beside Charles. She wore a plain gray dress, clean but clearly worn, with careful stitching at the cuffs and hem. Her hair was wrapped in a faded blue cloth, yet the way she carried herself gave her an air of dignity rather than need. She appeared no older than 25. Her features suggested mixed heritage, with high cheekbones, amber-colored eyes that seemed deep and thoughtful, and skin the color of warm honey. Around her neck hung a small silver locket, the only decoration she had, catching light as she breathed. She stood quietly, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered to the stones beneath her feet. There was something about her stillness that caught Henry's attention. It suggested a person used to being watched, someone who had learned how to fade into herself while remaining present. He walked closer, studying her with the trained gaze of a man raised to judge human beings as property, a habit that had always troubled him. He remembered his father teaching him how to measure value by teeth, hands, posture. The memory unsettled him now, though he could not fully explain why. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone softer than he expected. "Margaret, sir." Her voice was gentle but clear, marked by an accent that hinted at more education than most enslaved people received. There was a slight French sound to her words, the kind common in New Orleans rather than the countryside. "Margaret," he repeated silently. It was a familiar name, yet the way she said it stirred something uneasy in his chest, like a memory trying to surface. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her eyes slowly, and in that instant Henry felt as if the ground shifted beneath him. Those eyes, that rare shade of amber mixed with green, were unmistakable. He had seen them every morning in the mirror when the light hit his face just right. He had seen them in the portrait of his father hanging in the library, painted years before age and duty had hardened his expression. The resemblance was too strong to deny. The oval shape of her face, the firm jaw, the thoughtful tilt of her head when listening, even the small crease between her brows when she focused, all of it mirrored his own features with disturbing accuracy. His breath caught. Charles continued talking about her skills, her former owners in Natchez, and the glowing references she carried, but Henry barely heard a word. His thoughts raced, forming connections he did not want to accept. "Where were you born?" he asked sharply, cutting across Charles's speech. "In New Orleans, sir, on Rue Dauphine." Her voice stayed steady, though something flickered in her eyes. She had noticed his reaction. Henry's hands turned cold despite the mild air. His father had owned a townhouse on Rue Dauphine for many years, visiting often on business trips that lasted weeks. His mother had never questioned those absences, or perhaps she chose not to. Henry himself had visited the house once at 15, sent to deliver papers to a lawyer. He remembered little until the memory suddenly sharpened. A flowered courtyard, blue wallpaper with birds, a woman opening the door, a child peeking from behind her skirts. The child had been 7 or 8, with curious amber eyes fixed on him. He had stared back for half a minute before the woman gently pulled her away. At the time, he had assumed she was a servant's child. He had seen his sister and never known it. "Who was your mother?" he asked quietly. Margot paused, and pain crossed her face. "Her name was Celeste Dubois. She died when I was 12. The name meant nothing to him, but the dates aligned with cruel precision. He had been 19 when Margot was born, living in New Orleans, busy with studies and social life. His father would have been 53, still strong, still traveling, still living a hidden life away from Bel-Air and his lawful family. Charles watched them with growing concern. "Henry, is something wrong? If she's not suitable, I can have her returned. There's no obligation. I only thought." "No." The word came out quickly. Henry cleared his throat. "No, she's fine. Thank you, Charles. It's a generous gift. Very generous." Inside, his thoughts spun wildly as he searched for another explanation. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe many people shared similar features. Maybe guilt was forcing his mind to see patterns that were not there. But deep inside, where truth exists before words, he already knew. The woman standing before him, given as property, wrapped like a Christmas present, was his sister. His half-sister. The daughter of an enslaved woman his father had kept in secret, raised with his father's money, then sold when that arrangement ended. Now, by law, she belonged to him. The realization made him feel sick. Charles kept talking, going over the plans he had arranged, the money he had spent, and the documents that would need signatures. Henry made himself listen. He nodded at the right moments and answered when expected, acting the part of a man thankful for a generous present. He thanked Charles again and again, asked him to stay for Christmas dinner, and called for one of the household servants to guide Margot to her room. As Margot followed the servant toward the house, she looked back once. Her amber-colored eyes met his. In that short instant, Henry felt his chest tighten. There was something in her look that unsettled him deeply. A spark of recognition, of shared understanding, of a truth neither of them could speak aloud. She knew, or at least suspected. She had noticed the resemblance just as he had. She had drawn the same frightening conclusions. Now they were both caught in a situation neither had chosen, tied together by blood and hidden history in a way that made any real relationship impossible. Before continuing with the story of Henry Dufresne and the sister he never knew existed, I want to pause for a moment. If you are enjoying this dark story from Louisiana's past, please subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and turn on notifications so you do not miss future historical mysteries. I would also love to know where you are listening from. Leave a comment telling me your city or state. Now let us return to Bel-Air Plantation, where Henry is about to uncover how deep his father's secrets truly go. Henry did not sleep that night. Christmas dinner had been unbearable. Charles and several guests from nearby plantations filled the dining room with loud conversation and laughter. Henry struggled to appear normal, but his attention kept drifting to Margot as she moved through the room, calmly directing the servants. Every glimpse of her face felt like a sharp pain in his chest. Around 3 in the morning, unable to endure the dark or his thoughts any longer, he got up, dressed quietly, and went to his father's study. If answers existed, they would be hidden there among the neatly kept ledgers and letters that recorded 30 years of plantation business. The study looked exactly as his father had left it. Henry had not been able to change anything in the 6 months since Etienne's death. The large desk still held his father's favorite pen, the one with the silver tip used to sign every important paper. Shelves along the walls were filled with books, law volumes, farming guides, and histories of Louisiana and France. The room still smelled faintly of his father's tobacco, a special blend imported from Cuba. Henry lit the oil lamp on the desk and began to search. He started with the financial books, the leather-bound ledgers his father had kept so carefully. Etienne Dufresne believed strongly in records and proof. Every cost was written down, every payment listed, every transaction accounted for in detail. Henry worked backward through the years, looking for anything tied to the Rudolpine property. He found the entries without trouble. Monthly payments for upkeep, larger amounts now and then for repairs or furniture. The sums were large but reasonable, just what one would expect for a townhouse in a desirable part of New Orleans. But there were other payments as well, regular amounts sent to someone listed only as CD. These payments had continued for 25 years and stopped suddenly 8 months before his father died. The sums varied. Sometimes $50, sometimes $100, sometimes more. Over time they added up to enough to support a comfortable life in the city. 8 months. Margot had said her mother died when she was 12. Margot was now 25, which meant Celeste had died 13 years earlier. The dates did not match. Confused, Henry pulled out another ledger, this one holding copies of letters. His father had kept duplicates of important correspondence, arranged by year with the same careful order. Henry turned to 1834, the year Margot would have been born, but found nothing unusual. Then he checked 1835. There he found a letter from a New Orleans lawyer confirming the purchase of a house on Rudolpine Street and the creation of a trust to maintain it. The letter was formal and cold, giving no hint of the human story behind it. Pinned to it was a tiny piece of paper, folded again and again until it was no bigger than a stamp. Henry's hand shook as he unfolded it and smoothed the creases. The handwriting was clearly a woman's, neat and educated, shaped by years of careful teaching. It said, "Etienne, she has your eyes. I have named her Margot after your mother. I ask nothing for myself, but please let her have a chance at a better life than mine. Let her learn to read. Let her know beauty. Let her believe, even for a short time, that the world can be kind." Henry sank back into his chair. The note slipped from his fingers onto the desk. His grandmother's name had been Margot. He had never met her. She had died before he was born, but he had heard stories. She was educated in France, refined and cultured, a woman who insisted her sons be taught by French tutors. His father had spoken of her with great respect and kept her portrait in his bedroom until his death. And he had named his daughter by an enslaved woman after her. The cruelty of it hit Henry like a blow. His father had acknowledged the child enough to give her that name, to pay for her education, to provide a home and money for her mother, yet he had never freed them. He had never made Margot legitimate. He kept her hidden, a secret managed with distance and money. Henry searched through the night, uncovering more proof. There were receipts for piano lessons from when Margot would have been 6. Bills for books, not just basic readers but novels, poetry, and philosophy. Payments to a dressmaker for clothes suited for a young lady of society, not an enslaved child. His father had given Margot an education that was rare for any woman of that time, free or enslaved. Still, he had never freed her. That was the detail Henry could not understand. It troubled him deeply as the night dragged on and the oil lamp burned low. Etienne had the power to free Margot and her mother with a single legal act. The laws in Louisiana made it difficult, but not impossible. He could have done it. He chose not to. Why? The answer, Henry realized bitterly, was likely simple. Freedom would have meant acknowledgement. It would have raised questions about Margot's identity and her father. It would have threatened the careful social standing Etienne had built his entire life. It was easier to keep them comfortable but controlled, supported but powerless. Easier to pretend they were only property treated kindly, not family he lacked the courage to claim. As dawn broke over Bel-Air, painting the sky with pink and gold, Henry found one last document. It was hidden in the back of a ledger from 1846, the year before his father died. It was another letter from the same New Orleans lawyer, informing Etienne that Celeste Dubois had died and asking for instructions about her property and her daughter's future. His father's reply was clipped to it. Continue the trust for the property. Make no changes regarding the girl. She is to remain as she is until further notice. E.D. She is to remain as she is, not free her, not protect her, not secure her future. Just leave her enslaved and exposed to whatever might happen when circumstances changed. And circumstances had changed. The trust ended with Etienne's death. Margot had been sold to settle matters, passed through unknown hands, judged and priced like an animal, and finally purchased as a Christmas gift for her own half-brother. Henry thought of his father's funeral, the grand service at the parish church. The governor had attended. The bishop had spoken, praising Ian Dufresne as a man of honor, generosity, and importance to Louisiana. What would they say if they knew about the woman on Rudolpine Street, about the daughter kept as property, about the son who now owned his own sister? The sounds of the household waking pulled Henry from his thoughts. He heard pots clanging in the kitchen and low voices beginning the day. Somewhere among them was Margot, starting her first full morning at Bel-Air, unaware that the man who owned her was her brother. Or was she unaware? That question had haunted him all night. Had Celeste told her the truth, or had she hidden it to spare her daughter the pain of knowing her blood tied her to a man who never claimed her? Henry needed to know, but he could not ask directly. The question itself would reveal too much and create danger for both of them. He would have to be careful and patient. He would need to learn the truth without exposing his own knowledge. The morning after Christmas arrived gray and cold, with fog rolling in from the river and settling over Bel-Air like a heavy veil. Henry left the study exhausted, his eyes burning from sleeplessness and long hours by lamplight. He had uncovered so much, yet the most important answer still escaped him. Did Margot know who her father was? Had she made the same connection he had when their eyes met in the courtyard? He found her in the main house, in the morning room overlooking the gardens. She was quietly instructing two other enslaved women as they cleaned the windows and arranged the furniture. She moved with calm purpose, unaware that Henry was watching, and with each step she took, the weight of the truth pressed heavier on him. Punctuation was precise, her directions clear and respectful. The other women answered her in a way that showed she had already set her place in the household order, even though she had arrived only the day before. "Margot," Henry said from the doorway. She turned at once, her face carefully blank. "Yes, sir. I would like to speak with you." In the library, he caught a brief flash of worry in her eyes, quickly hidden. She followed him down the hall, keeping the proper distance. 3 steps behind him, never at his side. Her steps were almost silent on the polished wooden floor. It was a pattern she had learned long ago, the careful movements of service that kept enslaved people safe by making them unnoticed. The library was Henry's favorite room in the house. Shelves of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, volumes his father had gathered over many years. Most of them had never been read, bought more for show than for learning. Still, Henry had always loved the room, the smell of leather and paper, the way sunlight spilled through the tall windows, and the feeling of being surrounded by knowledge and possibility. As a child, it had been his refuge when the cruelty of plantation life became too heavy to endure. Now, it felt more like a place of confession. "Close the door," Henry said, and he saw her pause before doing as she was told. He knew how this must appear, a master calling a female slave into a private room and ordering the door shut. The meaning was clear and disturbing. He needed to make it clear quickly that this was not that kind of meeting. "You said you can read." Henry began, motioning toward the shelves. "Yes, sir. That's uncommon. How did you learn?" "My mother arranged lessons when I was young. She believed education mattered. Margot's voice was calm, but Henry could hear the care in it. The way she chose each word carefully. Your mother must have been remarkable. Something softened in Margot's face, a small change around her eyes, as real feeling slipped past the careful mask. She was, sir. She was the most remarkable person I have ever known. She died believing I would have a better life than she did. The words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Celeste had died believing her daughter would be safe, educated, and able to move through the world with grace. Instead, Margot had been sold, made into property, and placed in the household of her own brother. "And your father?" Henry asked, keeping his tone light. "Did you know him?" The question was too direct, too personal, but he needed the answer. Margot's face closed again, smooth and unreadable. "No, sir. My mother never spoke of him." It might have been the truth, or it might have been the answer she had learned to give, the safest response, one that protected both her and her mother's memory. Henry could not tell. He studied her closely, searching for any sign that she knew more than she said. But she had learned too well how to hide herself, how to show only what was safe. "I see." Henry walked to the window and looked out over the land. The sugar-cane fields stretched far into the distance, brown and resting in the winter cold. In a few months they would turn green again, growing toward the harsh harvest season that would consume every waking hour from August to December. The cycle never changed, year after year, generation after generation. "You will work in the main house," he said at last, still facing the view. "Household management, as Charles mentioned. You will report directly to me, not to the overseer. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "You will have your own room in the house, not in the quarters. You will take your meals in the kitchen with the other house staff. You will be treated with respect." He turned to face her, meeting her eyes fully. "And if anyone at all treats you differently, you will tell me at once. Do you understand?" Margot's eyes widened slightly. It was an unusual speech for a master to give a newly purchased slave, and Henry could see her trying to understand it, trying to decide what it meant and what he expected from her. Was this kindness, or was it something more complex and more dangerous? "Thank you, sir," she said carefully, her voice revealing nothing. "That is all. You may go." She left quickly. Henry sank into his father's chair, now his chair, and felt the weight of his inheritance settle on him like something solid and crushing. He owned his sister. The law said she was his property, free to sell, punish, or use as he wished without question. The thought made him feel sick. He spent the rest of the morning in the library, trying to focus on the plantation accounts that demanded his attention. But his thoughts kept returning to Margot, and to the impossible situation his father had left behind. What was he supposed to do? He could not simply free her, not right away. The legal process of manumission was complicated, requiring approval from the parish court, and a financial bond to prove the freed person would not become a public burden. A sudden act of freedom would raise questions and invite unwanted attention. And what would he say if asked? That he had discovered she was his sister. That would mean explaining how he knew, which would expose his father's secret and destroy the Dufresne family's name. The scandal would be enormous. He would be shut out of Louisiana society, his business ties would fall apart, and even Bel-Air itself might be at risk, yet keeping her enslaved was unbearable. Every moment she remained his property was a moral wrong, a continuation of the harm his father had caused. Henry was caught between two impossible choices, with no clear path forward. The weeks after Christmas passed in a strange, tense balance. Margot proved to be exactly what Charles had promised. She was efficient, intelligent, and capable, running the household with a skill that impressed even the long-serving staff who had worked for the Dufresne family for decades. She moved through Bel-Air like a shadow, present but never intrusive, always anticipating needs before they were spoken, managing the many details of a large household with calm ease. Henry watched her often, searching for signs that she knew the truth. At times he noticed her standing before his father's portrait in the library, studying it with an unreadable expression. The painting showed Ian Dufresne in his prime, perhaps 40 years old, dressed formally, one hand resting on a globe as a sign of his success and worldliness. The artist had captured something in his eyes, a sharp intensity that Henry had always found unsettling. Once, Henry found Margot in the music room, standing before the grand piano that had belonged to his mother. Her fingers hovered above the keys without touching them, as if she were remembering something long past, or holding herself back from something she deeply wanted. "Do you play?" Henry asked from the doorway. She startled as if burned, her hands dropping to her sides. "I did, sir. Once. My mother arranged lessons when I was young. Play something now." "Sir, I don't think that would be appropriate. I haven't played in years." "It wasn't a request, Margot." Henry's voice was firmer than he meant it to be, but he needed to know. Music was one of the few things that could slip past careful defenses and reveal what lay beneath. She sat at the piano slowly, her body stiff with tension. Her hands settled on the keys, and after a brief pause she began to play. The piece was Chopin, a nocturne performed with a level of skill that spoke of years of serious training. Yet it was the feeling in her playing that struck Henry most. A deep, aching sadness flowed from her fingers into the music, filling the room with a grief so strong it was almost painful to hear. Each note was precise and controlled, yet heavy with emotion. Henry held his breath, caught by the beauty and sorrow of it. This was not the playing of someone who had learned music as a small accomplishment. This was the work of someone who had poured herself into the instrument, who had found in music a shelter from a world that offered little comfort. When she finished, the silence felt thick and pressing. Henry realized his hands were clenched and his jaw tight. He forced himself to relax and breathe. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice rough. "At my mother's house, sir. We had a piano. She said music was important, that it could take you places you could not go otherwise." Her voice was soft, distant, as if she were speaking from far away. "She used to sit with me while I practiced for hours. She said that no matter what happened, no matter where I ended up, the music would always belong to me. No one could take it away." "Your mother's house," Henry repeated, his throat tight. "On Rudolphin." Her hands went still on the keys. "Yes, sir. Tell me about it, the house." She was quiet for a long moment, and Henry thought she might refuse. Then she began to speak, her voice low and almost dreamlike. "It was small but beautiful. There were flowers in the courtyard, jasmine and roses. My mother cared for them herself, trimming them carefully and speaking to them as she worked. She said plants could feel love, that they grew better when treated kindly. The parlor had blue wallpaper with silver birds. I used to count them when I was meant to be practicing piano. There were 47 birds on that wall. I counted them so many times, and it was always 47. Henry's throat tightened. He had been to that house once years before, sent by his father to deliver papers to the lawyer who managed the property. He had been about 15, too young to understand what he was seeing, too trusting to question why his father kept a separate home in the city. He remembered the courtyard clearly, the quiet beauty of it, and the feeling that the place held more meaning than he could then understand. Flowers, the blue wallpaper with silver birds. He remembered a woman opening the door, Celeste, though at the time he had not known her name. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, had peeked out from behind her skirts, staring at him with curious amber eyes. He had looked straight at his sister and still had not recognized her. They had stood in the same room, breathed the same air, and yet he had seen only a child who meant nothing to him. "What happened to the house?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer from the papers he had discovered. "It was sold after my mother died. The lawyer said the agreement had ended, and there was no provision for me to stay there. I was sent to work for a family in the Garden District. They were kind as much as they could be. The mistress taught me fine needlework, and I was allowed to keep reading in my free time. But when they fell on hard times 3 years later, they sold me to settle their debts." She spoke plainly, as if she were describing the weather instead of the complete breaking apart of her life. "I've learned that nothing lasts, sir. Not houses, not arrangements, not kindness. Everything can be taken away." The calm acceptance in her voice cut deeper than anger ever could. She had learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to take whatever fate handed her with quiet dignity. It was a way to survive, he realized, a way to protect herself from the constant disappointment of being property in a world that refused to see her as fully human. "You may play whenever you wish," he said suddenly. "The piano is here, it sits unused. My mother played it before she died. My father kept it in good condition but never touched it himself. It should be played. Music should not be left silent." She looked up at him, surprise breaking through her careful expression. "Sir, the piano." "Yes," he repeated. "Use it. Play whenever you have time. Think of it as part of your duties, if that makes it easier. The instrument needs regular playing to stay in good shape." "Thank you, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Henry heard the emotion behind it. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complicated. Confusion, maybe exhaustion. She was trying to understand why he was being kind to her, and what he might want in return. Henry left the room quickly, before he could say something he would regret, before he could speak the truth that burned in his chest like acid. He could not free her, not yet. The legal process was complicated, and any sudden act of manumission would raise questions he was not ready to answer. But he could offer her small dignities, small freedoms within the prison of her life. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was all he could do without destroying everything. Just when we thought we had uncovered all the Drain family's secrets, the situation at Belarive grows even more tangled. If this story gives you chills, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark historical mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next as Henry struggles with the impossible situation he has inherited. Spring arrived at Belarive with the usual rush of growth and activity. The sugarcane fields turned green almost overnight. The air became thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavy as if swallowing water, and the work of the plantation intensified. Henry threw himself into management with nearly desperate energy, trying to lose himself in the endless details of running such a large operation. He met with the overseers every day, reviewed work schedules, and tried to make sure the enslaved workers were treated as humanly as the cruel system allowed. He inspected the fields, the tools, and the sugar mill that would soon roar to life during harvest. He checked the accounts, negotiated with buyers in New Orleans, and handled the countless small problems that arose on a plantation the size of Belarive. But he could not escape the central problem of his life. Margot was everywhere. She managed the household, supervised the kitchen, and made sure everything ran smoothly. Every time he saw her, every time he heard her voice or caught sight of her profile, he was reminded of the impossible situation his father had left behind. The other house servants accepted her authority quickly. She gave instructions firmly but respectfully, and she never asked anyone to do work she would not do herself. Henry often saw her working alongside the other women, sleeves rolled up as she helped with laundry or cooking. The field workers, however, were more cautious. They saw her as someone raised above them, someone granted privileges they would never receive. Henry noticed the whispers and the looks they gave her as she passed. There was resentment, and he understood why. In a system where everyone was oppressed, any small advantage gained by one person felt like a loss to everyone else. In April, a letter arrived that changed everything. It came from New Orleans, from the law office of Bogard and Associates. Henry opened it in his study, expecting routine business, a contract to review or a payment to approve. Instead, he read words that made his blood turn cold. "Dear Mr. Dufresne," the letter began in the formal, careful style lawyers favored. "It is my duty to inform you of a matter concerning your late father's estate that has recently come to light. Among the papers of my late partner, Mr. Longs Beauregard, who passed away last month, we discovered a sealed document dated 1834. It contained instructions that it be delivered to Eaton Dufresne's heir once certain conditions were met. Those conditions have now been fulfilled, and I am required by my late partner's agreement to forward this document to you. Please find it enclosed. Should you have any questions, I remain at your service. Respectfully yours, Jean-Baptiste Morero, attorney at law." Attached was a smaller envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax and marked with his father's signet ring. The seal was unbroken, meaning no one had read it since it was written 13 years earlier. Henry's hands trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. His father's handwriting stared back at him, firm and clear despite the years. The ink had faded from black to brown, but the words were still easy to read. Henry, the letter began. The use of his name instead of a formal greeting made his stomach tighten. His father rarely addressed him so personally in writing. The closeness of it suggested something deeply private, something his father had struggled to say. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and certain events have occurred that I hoped would never happen. I was a coward for not telling you this while I lived. Yet I cannot face my grave without making sure you know the truth, even if I lack the courage to say it aloud. In 1833 I met a woman named Celeste Dubois. She was enslaved, owned by a merchant preparing to return to France. I told myself that I purchased her freedom. In truth, I purchased her, and by doing so I bound her to me as tightly as any chain. She was educated, cultured, and more refined than many white women I knew. She spoke French like a Paris native, played the piano beautifully, and had read more books than most men of my acquaintance. I told myself I loved her. Perhaps I did, in my own way, but I loved my position more. I loved the respect of my peers, the safety of my status, the comfort of life at Bel-Air. I loved what I had more than I loved her. When she told me she carried my child, I made a choice. I could have freed them both. I could have claimed my daughter, faced the scandal, and lived with the results. Instead, I established the house on Rue de Pine. I provided money. I visited when I could, which was far too rarely. I convinced myself this was enough, that it counted as love, that I was doing the best I could. It was not love. It was cowardice dressed as practicality. It was selfishness pretending to be responsibility. Margot, my daughter, your sister, grew up knowing she had a father who would never claim her. Celeste never told her my name, but she knew I existed. She knew I chose my lawful family over her. I saw that knowledge in her eyes as she grew older. The understanding that she was a secret, a problem to be managed. I saw it, and I did nothing. I tell you this now because I fear what may happen after my death. The trust I created will end when Celeste dies. I made no further plans because doing so would have required explanations I was unwilling to give. If Margot has been sold, if she has entered the very system I benefited from all my life, then you must find her. You must free her. You must give her the life I was too weak to give. This is not a request, Henry. It is a command from your father and a plea from a man who knows he failed in the most basic way a human being can fail. Make this right. Do what I could not. Be the man I should have been. I left instructions with Bogart to deliver this letter only if two conditions were met. First, that I am dead. Second, that Celeste has also passed away. If you are reading this, then both are true, and Margot is alone in the world, open to whatever fate awaits her. Find her. Free her. Give her the family she should have had from the beginning. Your father, Etienne Dufresne. Henry read the letter 3 times. Each reading brought new waves of anger, grief, shame, and a crushing sense of responsibility. His father had known. He had known exactly what could happen, and still he had done nothing to stop it. He had written this letter 13 years earlier, when Margot was 12, and then lived another 13 years without acting on it. 13 years in which he could have freed her himself, faced the consequences, and done what was right. Instead, he chose silence. He had died and left his son to inherit not only his money and land, but also his sins. The worst part was the timing. The letter had been written 13 years earlier, when Margot was only 12. His father had gone on living for another 13 years after writing it. 13 years in which he could have done something, could have freed Margot himself, could have faced the result of his actions. Instead, he kept the arrangement going, kept sending the money, kept visiting the house on Rue Dauphine whenever business brought him to New Orleans. And then he died, leaving Henry to deal with the damage. Henry stood and walked toward the window, the letter crushed tightly in his hand. Outside, the plantation buzzed with life. Enslaved workers moved through the fields, caring for the young cane plants. The overseer rode back and forth on his horse, watching closely, ready to punish anyone who slowed down. It was a sight Henry had seen thousands of times, so familiar that he had stopped truly noticing it. But now it looked different. Every person in those fields was someone's child, someone's sibling, someone who had a life and a past. They all had families and stories that had been torn apart by the very system that made families like the Dufresnes wealthy. And Henry was part of that system. He benefited from it. He helped keep it alive every day he stayed at Bellear. The realization made his stomach turn. He went back to the desk and carefully flattened the letter, reading it once more. His father's words felt like a cruel challenge staring up at him. Make this right. Do what I could not. But how? How was he supposed to fix something so deeply wrong? How could he give Margot the family she should have had when that family was built on slavery, when the money that could support her came from the suffering of people just like her? There were no clean solutions. There were only choices, and each one carried its own heavy cost. Henry spent 3 days thinking, barely sleeping. He could free Margot immediately, but that would bring questions he did not know how to answer. He could send her away with money and documents, but that felt like another rejection, another man choosing the easier road instead of the right one. He could tell her the truth, but what comfort would that bring? What good was it to know that her brother owned her, that the family she had been denied was now her prison? In the end, the choice was made for him. Late one evening, he sat alone in the library with his father's letters spread across the desk. A soft knock sounded at the door. Before he could speak, Margot entered, holding a tray with coffee and brandy. She often brought him refreshments in the evening, a small duty she did without being asked. She placed the tray on the side table and turned to leave. "Wet," Henry said. She stopped, her hand resting on the door. "Close the door," she did, her face cautious. Henry suddenly saw how this must appear, a master calling an enslaved woman into his private room at night and ordering the door shut. The meaning was clear and disturbing. He had to explain himself quickly. "I need to tell you something," he said urgently. "And I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" Margot stood very still, her hands folded in front of her, her face carefully empty. Henry recognized the stance now. It was protection, a shield she had learned to use. She knew that private conversations with masters rarely ended well. "I know who your father was," Henry said, and she flinched as if struck. "I know about the house on Rudolph, about your mother, about the arrangement my father made. I know because I found his records. I found his letter." He slid the yellowed paper across the desk, read it. Margot did not move. "Sir, I don't think." "Read it," he said more sharply than he meant to. His voice was rough from 3 days without rest and from the weight of everything he felt. "Please, I need you to read it." She walked toward the desk slowly, like someone approaching danger. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the letter. Henry watched her face as she read. He saw the moment when understanding appeared, when the full truth settled in. Her fingers tightened, crumpling the edges of the paper. Her breathing grew fast and shallow. One tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. When she finished, she placed the letter back on the desk, smoothing it as if to undo the damage she had done to it. She looked at Henry with eyes full of a lifetime of pain, questions, and grief with no place to go. "You're my brother," she said. Her voice was flat, as if she were stating a simple fact instead of something that changed everything. "Yes, and you've known since Christmas." "Yes." She laughed then, a harsh, broken sound with no joy in it. It carried all the pain she had kept buried, all the anger and betrayal she had learned to hide just to survive. "Of course," she said. "Of course you knew. You saw it in my face, just like I saw myself in yours. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I wanted it to be true, so I was seeing things that weren't there. I told myself fate couldn't be that cruel. But you knew." "I didn't know what to do," Henry said quietly. "I still don't. You could free me," she said. The words were simple, clear, and powerful. "I will." "I am," he replied quickly. "The papers are already being prepared." "But Margot," he stopped, realizing it was the first time he had ever said her name without the distance of formality. "I don't want you to just disappear. I don't want to be another man who leaves you behind." "What do you want then?" Her voice sharpened, anger breaking through her control. "Do you want me to be thankful? Do you want me to forgive our father for owning my mother? For owning me? For choosing his comfort over our freedom? Do you want me to thank you for doing what should have been done the day I was born? What exactly do you want from me, Henry? Hearing his name from her felt like a blow to his chest. They were bound by blood, yet they were strangers. Worse than strangers, they were master and enslaved, owner and property separated by a distance that felt impossible to cross. Henry struggled to find the right words. I want to know you. I want to understand who you are, what you want, what your life could be if you were free to choose it. I want to be your brother, not your master. I want the relationship we should have had from the start. You can't be both, Margot said softly. Her anger faded into something tired and sad. As long as I'm enslaved, as long as I'm property, you can only be my master. That's how this system works. That's what our father understood, even if he pretended otherwise. You can't own someone and love them. You can't keep someone in chains and call it family. She was right, and Henry knew it. There was no safe middle path, no way to make peace with himself while the inequality remained. He had been searching for comfort, instead of facing the full horror of what he had inherited. The papers will be ready in 2 weeks, he said. I'm freeing you completely with enough money to start a life wherever you choose. New Orleans, if you want to go back there, or somewhere else. The North may be where you'll be safer. The choice will be yours. And then what? Margot asked, studying his face. Do we act like strangers? Do we accept what we are to each other? What does it mean to be siblings when we've lived in different worlds our entire lives? When one of us owned the other, even if only for a short time? Henry had no answer. The question was too big, tied to a system that made real family impossible. I don't know, he said at last, but I think we have to try to figure it out. We owe that to ourselves. And to your mother. She wanted more for you. She died believing you would have a chance at a better life. Maybe we can honor that, even if we can't fix everything else. Margot's face softened at the mention of Celeste. She never spoke badly of him, she said quietly. Our father. She never told me his name, but she never said an unkind word either. I think she loved him despite everything. Or maybe because of it. I never understood how she could love someone who kept her enslaved, who chose his name and comfort over her freedom. Love is complicated, Henry said, especially when it exists inside systems built to destroy it. Maybe she didn't forgive him. Maybe she just understood that he was weak and she refused to let his weakness ruin her. Margot moved to the window and looked out at the dark land. The moon rose slowly, casting pale light over the fields and the quarters where the enslaved workers lived. I used to imagine having a family, she said, a real one. Not just my mother and me in our small house, but brothers and sisters, a father who claimed me, a place where I belonged. I made up stories about them, about what we would do together. She turned back to Henry, tears shining on her cheeks in the moonlight. And now I find out I have a brother, and he's the man who owns me. The stories I told myself as a child never included that. The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. Henry wanted to comfort her, to somehow make things right, but he knew that words alone could never undo what had already been done. He paused, wanting to say more, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would fix the deep wrongness of their situation. They were both victims of their father's decisions, caught inside a system neither of them had built, yet both of them were forced to survive within it. I'm sorry, he said quietly, fully aware that the words were far too small. I'm sorry for everything, for our father's choices, for the system that allowed those choices to exist, for the fact that we are meeting like this instead of how we should have met, as family, as equals, as people who had the freedom to decide what kind of relationship we wanted. I know sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't change anything, Margot said, but her voice was softer now, the sharp edge of anger dulled. But I suppose it's a beginning. It's more than our father ever gave my mother, and more than most people in my position ever receive. They stood quietly for a long time, two people tied by blood yet divided by everything else, both trying to find some kind of path forward through a situation that felt impossible. 2 weeks, Henry said at last. In 2 weeks you'll be free. Then we'll figure out what comes next. Together, Margot nodded slowly. Together, she repeated as if testing the sound and meaning of the word. I've never had a brother before. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I, Henry admitted. But we'll learn. We have to. The 2 weeks before Margot's manumission papers were finalized passed in a strange, uneasy pause. She continued her work in the house, but everything between her and Henry had changed at its core. They were no longer master and slave, but they were not yet truly siblings either. They existed somewhere in between, in a space without clear rules, trying to shape a relationship that had no example to follow, no social guide to rely on. Henry found himself looking for her more often, asking her thoughts on household matters he had always handled by himself. He began to realize she understood the plantation in ways he never had. She suggested methods to make the work run more smoothly and ideas to treat the enslaved workers with more care, without harming productivity. She had spent her entire life watching, listening, and learning how systems worked from the viewpoint of someone with no power inside them. That viewpoint was valuable in ways Henry was only starting to understand. Margot, in turn, seemed to slowly relax. Little by little, she allowed glimpses of the person she might have been if she had been raised free. She was sharp, thoughtful, and carried a dry sense of humor that often caught Henry off guard. Once, when he was complaining about a particularly frustrating business negotiation, she said calmly, "Perhaps if you stopped trying so hard to be reasonable and simply told them what you want, they might respect you more. Reasonable people are often easy to take advantage of." Henry laughed, surprised by her honesty. "Is that what you think of me? That I'm too reasonable?" "I think you're trying to be a good man in a system that punishes goodness," she replied. "It's admirable, but it's also tiring to watch." The words stung, but Henry knew there was truth in them. He was trying to act humanly within an inhumane system, searching for moral ground where none truly existed. It was an impossible effort, and Margot saw through it with the clarity of someone who no longer believed in comforting illusions. One evening, they sat together in the library, breaking a rule that would have shocked anyone who witnessed it, and spoke openly about their childhoods. Henry talked about growing up at Belleair, about the pressure of being the younger son, always living in his brother's shadow until Philip's death made him the heir. He spoke of his education in New Orleans and the law practice he had been building before his father's death pulled him back to the plantation. Margot spoke of the house on Rue Dauphine and the careful balance her mother maintained between pride and survival. She described the education that set her apart from other enslaved people, but also made her pain sharper. "I could read Shakespeare," she said, "but I couldn't walk down the street without papers proving I had permission. I could play chopping, but I couldn't choose where I lived or who I spent my time with. The education my mother fought to give me only made me more aware of everything I was denied. Sometimes I wondered if not knowing would have been easier." "Do you resent her for that?" Henry asked gently. "For teaching you to want things you couldn't have?" Margot thought carefully before answering, her gaze distant. "No. I think she was trying to give me tools to survive, maybe even a path to something better. She couldn't free me herself. She had no money, no power, no legal standing. But she could give me knowledge, skills, and the ability to move between worlds. She did the best she could with what she had. I can't blame her for that." "Like our father," Henry said bitterly. "Doing the best he could, which still wasn't enough." "No," Margot agreed. "It wasn't enough. But I've learned most people don't do enough. Most choose comfort over justice and ease over courage. Our father wasn't unique, he was human. Weak, selfish, afraid, but human." Her fairness filled Henry with shame. She had every reason to hate their father and everyone who upheld the system that oppressed her. Instead, she chose understanding, seeing humanity even in those who denied hers. "You're remarkable," Henry said softly. Margot smiled, truly smiled, and it changed her face, making her look younger and lighter. "I'm a survivor, that's not the same thing. Being remarkable is a luxury I never had. I just learned how to adapt, how to protect myself in situations designed to break me." When the papers were finally completed, Henry called Margot into his study. The documents rested on his desk, signed and sealed, proof of her freedom, ready to be filed with the parish. Beside them was a bank draft for $5,000, enough to allow her a real start and real choices. It was a large amount, more than many free people of color would ever see in their lifetime. "It's finished," he said, sliding the papers toward her. "You're free." Margot picked them up with hands that trembled slightly. She read every line carefully, as if expecting a hidden condition or a cruel trick. When she finished, she placed the papers down and looked at Henry with an expression he struggled to name. Relief was there, but so was something heavier, perhaps grief or the weight of endless possibility. "Thank you," she said simply. "Where will you go?" Henry asked. Even though he feared the answer, he had grown used to her presence, to the strange comfort of having family close, even under such complicated terms. The idea of her leaving, of never seeing her again, filled him with an unexpected ache. "I don't know yet. I need time. I need to learn who I am when I'm not defined by someone else. I've been a daughter property, a responsibility my whole life. I want to know who I am when I'm just myself." Henry nodded, understanding even as his heart sank. "Will you stay in Louisiana? Maybe, maybe not. That's the beauty of freedom, isn't it? I get to choose. I decide where I go, what I do, who I become. It's frightening and exciting at the same time." She gathered the papers carefully and held them like something priceless. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "Henry," she said, using his name without formality for the first time. Hearing it felt like a gift. "Thank you for doing what our father couldn't. It doesn't erase the past, but it matters. It matters that you tried. It matters that you saw me as a person, not property. It matters that you're trying to be better than what you inherited." After she left, Henry remained alone in the study for a long time, weighed down by what had just happened. He had freed his sister, fulfilled his father's last command, and done what he believed was right. So why did it feel like he had lost something he could never replace? He realized it was because he had lost the chance for a normal relationship, the chance to know Margot as siblings should. Their bond would always be shaped by the truth that he had once owned her, even if only briefly. That mark would never fully fade. Perhaps it shouldn't. Perhaps they needed to carry that burden, to remember what had been done to them and to so many others. Maybe the discomfort was necessary, a reminder of the cost of the world they were born into. Margot left Belir 3 days later, on a morning when fog drifted in from the river and turned everything gray and unclear. Henry watched from the gallery as she climbed into the carriage bound for New Orleans, her belongings packed into a single trunk. She had refused his offers of more clothing, more luggage, more anything. "I want to start new," she had said. "I want to choose everything myself, from my clothes to my furniture to the books I read. I want my life to be mine." She looked up at him before the driver moved on, lifted her hand in farewell, and then she was gone, fading into the mist like a ghost, like something that had almost felt unreal. The house felt emptier without her. The staff continued their work, efficient and quiet. Margot had trained them well in her short time at Belir, but something important was missing. Henry understood that what she brought had nothing to do with skill or order. She had brought the possibility of redemption, the fragile hope that past wrongs could at least be faced, if not fully healed. Now she was gone, and Henry was left alone with his inheritance and his guilt. He buried himself in the work of the plantation, but his heart was no longer in it. He looked at the enslaved people in the fields and saw Margot in every face. He heard their voices and wondered what stories they carried, what families had been broken, what futures had been crushed by the system he continued to uphold simply by existing within it, by maintaining Belir, by accepting the life that had been handed to him without ever truly choosing it. The wealth had come from the work of others. For the first time in his life, Henry truly understood what his fortune rested on. It was not only sugar fields, land, and good market prices. It was human pain spread across generations, accepted as normal, protected by laws and defended by those who gained from it. His father had been one of those men. His grandfather had been one as well. And now Henry was part of it too, no matter how hard he tried to believe he was different, that he was better. The realization weighed heavily on him. It felt suffocating. Slowly, he began to introduce changes at Belir. At first they were small, almost cautious, but over time they became more meaningful. He lowered the work quotas, but knowing it would reduce his profits, but willing to accept that loss in exchange for slightly less cruelty. He made a firm rule that families would not be separated, refusing to sell anyone even when the money offered was tempting. He started a school where enslaved children could learn to read and write, and he hired a free woman of color from New Orleans to teach them. Of course, his neighbors noticed. They whispered about his softness, his lack of sense, his risky ideas. One evening, Charles Beaumont, the same man who had once given him Margot as a Christmas gift, confronted him while they shared brandy. Charles spoke bluntly, his face red from drink and irritation. He told Henry he was being foolish. Treating them like people, he said, would only make them unhappy with their position. He warned that Henry was creating trouble for himself and for everyone else. If one man's enslaved workers started expecting kindness, others would follow. He accused Henry of weakening the whole system. Henry answered calmly that they were people, and that was not an opinion but a fact. Charles replied that of course they were people, but they were also property, and the law supported that. He said the world worked this way and could not be changed by kindness. Henry looked him straight in the eyes and said the world does change, that laws change too. What seems natural and permanent in one generation can become unthinkable in the next. Slavery, he said, would not last forever. It could not. Charles shook his head and placed his glass down harder than needed. He said Henry had changed since his father's death and warned him that he was making enemies. People were talking, calling him an abolitionist supporter, calling him dangerous. Henry said they could talk, though fear crept into him. In Louisiana in 1847, such a label could cost a man his safety or his life. Still, he knew he could not return to how things were before. He could not forget what he now understood. Henry did not tell Charles about Margot. He did not explain that she was his sister, that he had once owned her, that the moral questions Charles brushed aside had become deeply personal. Some truths were too risky to share. They could destroy the fragile place Henry still held in society, even as he quietly tried to weaken the system that supported it. In June, a letter arrived from New Orleans. Henry recognized Margot's handwriting at once, and his hands trembled as he opened it. The letter began with, "Dear Henry," and that simple greeting tightened his throat. She wrote that she was well and adjusting to her new life. She had rented rooms in the French Quarter at a boarding house run by a kind, free woman of color. She said the freedom to choose still felt strange, that she sometimes caught herself waiting for permission she no longer needed. But she was learning. She felt she was becoming someone new, or perhaps becoming who she had always been beneath the roles she had been forced to play to survive. She wrote about thinking often of their father and the choices he had made. She said she could not fully hate him, even if part of her felt she should. He was a man trapped in a corrupt system and lacked the courage to stand against it. That made him weak, she said, but not a monster. Most people, she wrote, choose comfort instead of principle when tested. But Henry had been given a choice, and he had chosen what was right, even though it was difficult. That mattered. It did not fix everything, but it mattered. She said she did not know what their relationship would become. They were siblings, yet also strangers shaped by very different lives. Perhaps they would truly know each other one day, or perhaps they would remain connected by blood but divided by history. Either way, she wanted him to know she did not blame him for the circumstances of her birth or for the years she spent enslaved. He had inherited a terrible situation, and he had handled it with more grace than she ever expected. She thanked him for giving her freedom, for seeing her as a person instead of property, and for being the brother their father never allowed him to be. Henry read the letter many times. Each reading filled him with relief and sadness at once. Margot was safe. She was free. She did not hate him. Yet she was also gone, living a separate life, and he did not know if he would ever see her again. He wrote back immediately, pouring out his guilt, his anger toward their father, and the strange sorrow of finding family only to lose them again. He told her about the changes at Bel-Air, about his growing unease with the system he lived within, and about his confusion over what to do with the power and privilege he had inherited. Her reply arrived a month later, and her words shaped the path his life would take. She told him no one could decide for him what he should do, but she shared what she had learned. The past could not be changed, she wrote, but it did not have to be repeated. He owned 170 people, 170 human lives placed under his control. He could not free them all without destroying himself, and the courts would likely stop him anyway. But he could treat them with dignity. He could keep families together, teach them to read, give them skills, and prepare them for the day when slavery would finally end. And it would end, she insisted. It could not last forever. He could be a master who made slavery slightly less cruel, even while working toward a world where masters no longer existed. It would never be enough, she said, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. Henry followed Margot's advice as carefully as he could. He made changes slowly, always mindful of not drawing too much attention from neighbors or authorities. He refused every offer to buy individual workers, no matter how high the price. He expanded the school and required all children under 12 to attend, telling doubtful overseers that educated workers were more useful. He cut back the harsh quotas during harvest season, accepting smaller profits for less suffering. He improved the living quarters, making sure there was enough food, clothing, and basic medical care. He ended the use of the whip, replacing it with a system of rewards and restrictions that, while still controlling, was far less violent. Again, people noticed. Some neighbors stopped trading with him. Others warned that he was spoiling his workers and setting a dangerous example. A few hinted, not entirely as a joke, that he might be an abolitionist supporter. In the late 1840s, that was a serious and risky accusation. Still, Henry continued, he could not free the people he owned, but he could reduce their suffering and prepare them for a future he hoped would be different. He and Margot wrote to each other often. She had opened a small school in New Orleans, teaching free people of color and enslaved people whose owners allowed them to attend. It was dangerous work. Education threatened the social order, and laws limited what enslaved people could be taught. Yet she continued quietly, working within the system while slowly weakening it. In one letter she wrote that she taught them what their mother had taught her, that knowledge is power, that dignity cannot be given or taken by others, and that they were fully human no matter what the law claimed. It was small work, she said, but it was her work and her way of living in the world their father had helped create. Henry admired her bravery, but worried constantly for her safety. New Orleans was more tolerant than the countryside, but that tolerance had limits. A free woman of color who was too educated or too independent could quickly become a target. The system knew how to punish those who challenged it, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. His fears became real in September of 1849. A frightened letter arrived from one of Margot's students. Authorities had raided the school after a complaint about enslaved people being taught to read. Margot had been arrested for teaching without permission, for owning abolitionist writings, and for many other charges that together amounted to the crime of being too free and too defiant. Henry left Belir at once, placing it in the care of his most trusted overseer. He used every connection he had, spent money he could not spare, and called in every favor. After 3 days and a costly bribe, he secured her release from the parish jail. When he saw her, she looked thinner. There were bruises on her arms and a healing cut above her eye, but her spirit was intact and her eyes still burned with determination. Sitting with him in a small cafe by the river, speaking softly so no one would overhear, she told him she would not stop. She said she could not stop. "This is the only thing that makes sense to me. The only way I understand how to fight back against what was done to me, and to my mother and to all of us. You will get yourself killed," Hy said plainly, and fear made his voice sharp. "Then I will die free," Margot said as she held his gaze without wavering. "That is more than my mother ever had, more than most people like me will ever have. I will not live in fear, Hy. I will not shrink myself just to make other people feel comfortable. I have already spent too much of my life doing exactly that." Henry wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her to be careful and to protect herself and to stay alive. But he knew it would change nothing. She had found her reason. She had found a way to turn her pain into meaning. He had no right to take that away from her, even though it scared him deeply. "Let me help," he said instead. "Money or contacts or anything you need, let me matter in some way." Margot smiled, and for a brief moment he saw the sister she could have been if they had grown up side by side, and if the world had been kinder. "You already matter, Henry. You show that people can change and that they can choose to be better than the systems they are born into. That matters more than you realize. Every person you treat with respect and every family you keep together and every child you help learn to read, it all matters. You are planting seeds for a future you may never see, but that does not make the work less important." The years went by and the country moved slowly and surely toward a conflict that everyone sensed but no one could stop. The strain between North and South grew sharper. The arguments over slavery grew louder. The chance of compromise faded. Henry kept working at Bel Air, making small changes where he could. He treated the people he owned with as much dignity as the system allowed, and prepared them for a future he hoped would be different. Margot continued running her school and moved it often to stay ahead of the authorities. She taught anyone who wanted to learn. She became known in New Orleans as someone people could trust, someone who helped enslaved people learn to read, someone who provided papers for those trying to escape, someone who offered shelter to those who needed it. The work was dangerous, but she seemed alive in that danger. It gave her a sense of purpose that filled her life with meaning. They did not see each other often. The social risks of their connection made regular visits hard. Henry's growing reputation as someone who supported abolition made it risky for Margot to be linked to him too openly. But they wrote to each other often. Their letters became a record of two people trying to survive an impossible reality, trying to remain family despite everything that stood between them. In 1853, Margot wrote with news that shocked him. She was going to be married. The man was a free person of color, a carpenter named Thomas Laurent who had built a strong and successful business in New Orleans. From Margot's words, he sounded kind and thoughtful and fully supportive of her work. "I never believed I would marry," she wrote. "I never thought I could trust someone enough to share my life. But Thomas truly sees me, not as property, not as a symbol, not as a problem to be fixed. He sees me as myself. He knows my past. He knows about our father. He knows about you. And he loves me all the same. It is a gift I never thought I would receive." Henry traveled to New Orleans for the wedding. It was a small ceremony held in a Catholic church in the French Quarter. He sat in the back so he would not draw attention. He watched his sister marry a man who looked at her with clear love and respect. When she glanced back and met his eyes, she smiled. Henry felt something loosen inside his chest. A tight knot of guilt and sorrow he had carried since that Christmas morning 6 years earlier finally eased. After the ceremony, they spoke briefly in the courtyard. Thomas shook Henry's hand. His grip was firm but calm. His eyes studied Henry carefully, like a man who had learned to judge others for his own safety. "Thank you for coming," Margot said with her hand resting on Thomas' arm. "It means so much to me. I would not have missed it," Henry said, and he meant every word. "I am happy for you. Truly happy." "I know," she said. She squeezed his hand for a moment. A simple gesture that would have meant nothing unusual between most siblings, but felt fragile and precious between them. "And I am thankful for everything you have done and everything you still do. You are a good man, Henry. Our father would be proud." Henry was not sure that was true. He believed their father might have been disturbed by Margot's choices, by how she had broken the careful plans that once kept her hidden and controlled. But it no longer mattered what their father might have thought. What mattered was that Margot was free. She was happy. She was building a life by her own choices. That was enough. Henry returned to Bel Air and kept working as the political situation collapsed around him. He knew the world he had grown up in was ending. When the war finally began in 1861, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. The strain of trying to be kind within a cruel system had worn him down. The war years were harsh. Bel Air was occupied by Union forces in 1862. Henry found himself welcoming the army that destroyed his wealth. The enslaved people on his land were declared free by military order. Most of them left at once. Some searched for family who had been sold away. Others simply wanted to feel what it was like to move freely. Henry did not stop them. He gave them what money he could. He wrote letters of reference when asked. He wished them well. Some thanked him and acknowledged his small efforts to ease their suffering. Others left without saying a word. Their silence spoke loudly. It reminded him that no kindness could erase the deep wrong of owning another human being. When the war ended in 1865, Balir was nearly empty. The fields were wild. The machines were broken. The grand house showed years of neglect that would take more money than he had to repair. He sold most of the land. He kept only the house and a few acres nearby, enough to live simply. Not enough to keep the life he was born into. He was 49 years old. The world he knew was gone. In 1868, 3 years after the war ended, Henry received a letter from Margot. She invited him to visit her in New Orleans. She and Thomas had survived the war, though it had been hard. Their school had been destroyed, their home damaged, their savings drained. But they rebuilt. The school now operated openly and legally. It taught formerly enslaved people how to read and write and how to live in freedom. Henry took the train south. He passed through land still scarred by war. Fields lay empty. Buildings stood abandoned. Everywhere people struggled to understand what the new world would become. The city was loud and chaotic. Soldiers, freed men, and newcomers filled the streets. Everyone searched for a place in the new order. Margot met him at the station. Henry was struck by how much she had changed. She was 34 now. Her face showed signs of hard years. But she carried herself with confidence. She moved like someone who knew she belonged. Someone who believed she had the right to speak and decide and take up space. "Welcome," she said as she hugged him without hesitation. The embrace felt natural and easy, like something that should have always been allowed. It tightened Henry's throat. "Come and see what we have built." The school was inside a former warehouse turned into classrooms and a small library. It was full of students of every age. Children sat beside elderly people who had spent their whole lives enslaved and were now learning to read for the first time. Thomas taught mathematics. His voice was calm and patient as he explained fractions to a group of focused adults. "This is what freedom looks like," Margot said as she watched with pride. "It is messy and hard and uncertain, but it is real. These people are building lives, they are making choices, they are learning skills, they are becoming who they were always meant to be." Henry felt tears gather in his eyes. "Your mother would be proud." "Yes," Margot said softly. "She would be. And I think our father would be too, despite everything. He wanted this for me. He just lacked the courage to make it happen. In the end, his weakness led to something good. It led to you freeing me. That led to this school. This place changes lives every single day. Sometimes good things grow from bad beginnings." They spent the afternoon walking through the city. They spoke about the past and the future, about a country trying to rebuild from the ruins of war. Margot shared her plans to grow the school, to create more chances for freed men and women struggling in a society that still doubted them. "Will you help?" she asked as they stood by the river watching the Mississippi flow past. "I know you do not have much left, but anything you can give, money, connections, advice, it would help." "Of course," Henry said without pause. "Whatever I have is yours. It always has been." Margot smiled and took his hand. The gesture was simple but powerful. "We are family, Henry, truly family, not because the law says so, but because we choose to be. That is what freedom means, the power to choose who we are and who we love." As the sun sank over the Mississippi and turned the water gold and orange, Henry understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not one great act, not a perfect moment, but a long and difficult journey of choosing better, of trying every day to do what is right even when it is hard. It was about fixing what had been broken and trying to create something new from the ruins of the past. He had inherited his father's sins, whether he wanted them or not. But he had also inherited a chance to choose a better path. With Margot by his side, with her strength, her clear vision, and her refusal to let her past define her, he was slowly learning how to change. Erasing the past was never possible. Nothing could truly do that. The long years Margot had lived in bondage, the pain suffered by the hundreds of people who worked at Balir, and the many families torn apart by the system were wounds that could never be undone. Still, it mattered. As Margot had written to him many years earlier, doing something was always better than doing nothing. At last, They were siblings in the way they should have been from the start, not master and slave, not owner and property, but two human beings tied by blood and by choice, standing together and working to shape a world where the horrors they had known could no longer exist. It was only a small victory in a nation still struggling with the deep legacy of slavery, but it was their victory. It was earned through suffering, bravery, and the strong refusal to believe that the past had to control the future. In the end, that was all anyone could really do: take the broken pieces they were given and try to build something better from them. The story of Henry and Margot Dufresne did not end with a perfect solution, but it ended with hope. And sometimes, in a world as damaged as theirs once was, hope is enough. This mystery reminds us that the darkest secrets are often not found in ghosts or the supernatural, but in human choices and the systems people continue to support. What do you think about this story? Do you feel everything was uncovered, or do you think there are still secrets hidden deep in Louisiana's past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical mysteries like it, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Turn on the notification bell and share this with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next one.